Hello, and welcome to Obscure Fare, the podcast dedicated to the study of humanity's lesser-known attempts to kill each other. I'm your host, Henry Edwards. This episode is the first in a new series of episodes on the Indian Mutiny of 1857, in which I'll be covering the sieges of Lucknow and Cawnpore. In both cases, a tiny British garrison will attempt to hold weak positions and protect hundreds of civilians against overwhelming numbers of mutinous sepoys or native Indian soldiers intent on their slaughter. Before we start, I should warn listeners that this episode, and every subsequent episode on the Indian Mutiny, will contain graphic depictions of violence against women and children, so perhaps avoid this series if that's understandably not something you're comfortable with. But, without further ado, I'll get right into our narrative, in the summer of 1857. Like the Zulu War, I'll eschew describing, in too much detail, the causes of the Indian Mutiny, or the rest of the conflict, because it's just too big, and most of it isn't relevant to Cawnpore. To put it simply, though, the violence and uprisings that occurred were mostly the actions of disgruntled sections of the Bengal army, particularly the high-caste Hindu members of the infantry, and many of the Muslim sowars, a sowar being a native cavalryman, who dominated the mounted regiments. They were unhappy for a great deal of reasons, ranging from absentee and poor officers to low pay and unpopular uniforms. The best-known cause when most people consider the Sepoy Rebellion is probably the Greased Cartridge. Whilst it is true that, in the spring of 1857, the British had started to issue their Indian troops with the new Enfield rifle, which, due to the tight rifling of this weapon's design, required greased bullets to be able to load, it is probably a myth that the grease used would be objectionable to any of the sepoys on religious grounds. Rumour had it that a mixture of pork and beef fat was used, which would violate the beliefs of both Muslims and Hindus, Muslims because they consider pigs filthy and untouchable, and Hindus who believe cows to be sacred and thus inedible. As I've said, this was probably untrue. The cartridges were greased by an Indian firm after all. Additionally, no sepoy was ever actually issued with a greased cartridge, and as soon as the rumour was brought to the attention of the British authorities, at that time the operatives of the East India Company, they passed a ruling that allowed sepoys to grease the cartridges with whatever material they liked. It is probably safe to assume, then, in the light of this information, all of which I've taken from the books of Saul David and William Dalrymple, that the greased cartridge controversy was likely a construct of the mutineers designed as a flashpoint for their rebellion, and the true cause was years of discontent with the inefficient and sharkish rule of the EIC and their mistreatment of their Bengal soldiers. The last thing to consider in our whistle-stop tour of the causes of the Indian Mutiny is the annexation of the province of Oudh. This warlike and wild province had been occupied by the British several years before the outbreak of mutiny, and, in the process, many of the powerful warlords and chieftains had been stripped of their lands and wealth. Naturally, when the time came for revolt, these leaders were quick to join the revolutionary cause. Both Cawnpore and Lucknow were located in the province. Indeed, Lucknow was its ancient capital, and as such were sitting ducks when news of the rebellion arrived in Oudh, which it did on the 14th of May. The revolt had broken out at Meerut, a small garrison town on the Grand Trunk Road that ran from one side of India to the other, where mutinous sepoys had broken into the armoury, massacred their officers and the entire European population of the town, and then marched on Delhi, the Indian capital. There they overturned the British rule and pledged themselves to the service of Bahadur Shah, the Mughal emperor and former puppet of the EIC. From there the rebellion grew quickly, with most of northern India in open revolt by April, and most of the British forces besieged in their fortresses. The British station, or cantonment, at Cawnpore was one of the largest in India. 10 square miles of fortified buildings stretching along the banks of the river Ganges. The commander of the station, and its mixed garrison of European and native troops, was Major General Sir Hugh Wheeler, an Irish-born son of a senior East India Company official. He had emigrated to India in 1805 at the age of 16, enlisting as one of the white officers commanding a regiment of sepoys. By the outbreak of rebellion in 1857, he had acquired a formidable reputation as a fighting soldier, but he was not valued particularly as a bureaucrat or administrator. He did, however, fully deserve his reputation as a fighter. He was, by all accounts, a calm and courageous officer, and his conduct in battle had earned him a knighthood, a position as aide-de-camp to the Queen, and a CB. All of this contributed to his appointment as commander of the Cawnpore garrison in 1856. By then he was 67, and according to the Lord Canning, Governor-General of India at the time, he was, quote, "short, of spare habit, and very grey, with a quick and intelligent eye. Not imposing in appearance, except by virtue of his thoroughly military gait." End quote. He was, from head to foot, an old-style EIC officer. He was loved by his men, spoke the local language, and had been proven in battle, and had married a local woman. He was, it seemed, the perfect man to hold Cawnpore from the rebels. His one flaw, according to his assistant, was that, quote, "he placed too much reliance on the Easterns." End quote. As mentioned, news of the revolt at Meerut reached Wheeler on the 14th of May, but Wheeler did not seem concerned. He sent a telegram to Canning on the 16th, telling him that, quote, "the troops are loyal and well disposed." End quote. The reason Cawnpore was in such a precarious position was twofold. Firstly, the local population in Oud, as well as most of the EIC sepoys, were still loyal to their old rulers, the deposed King of Oud and the local warlords. In fact, most of the sepoys garrisoning the province were drafted directly from the defeated armies of these warlords, giving them little motive to remain loyal to what appeared to be, in April of 1857, a dying company hegemony. Secondly, the European presence at the cantonment was tiny, roughly 170 European officers and men, made up of 60 invalids from the 32nd Regiment of Foot, 61 artillerymen with 6 guns, and the rest were officers from the sepoy regiments and the government administration. This minuscule force was expected to hold out against the native presence if it mutinied. More than 3,000 sepoys from the 1st, 53rd and 56th Native Infantry Regiments and the 2nd Light Cavalry Regiment. Additionally, there were 2 companies of Indian artillerymen, completing a disgruntled Indian contingent that outnumbered the British 17-1. Before we continue, I'd like to quickly cover armament and uniforms. The British troops were uniformed in their namesake red coats, the shade rose madder to be exact, and most were armed with the 1853 pattern Enfield rifle, the weapon whose cartridges had caused such a stir. At about a metre long, this weapon fired a half-inch ball and was accurate up to 600 yards for volley fire, but could be used effectively at ranges of up to 900 yards by a decent marksman. The fire rate was an average 3 to 4 rounds per minute. This rifle was made more effective by the 14-inch sword bayonet that was clipped to the end of the barrel, turning the weapon into a sort of spear, 5.5 feet long and wickedly sharp. A decent weapon for the infantryman. Officers were armed with Dean and Avon's revolvers, 5-shot pistols with a roughly 44 caliber ball, as well as swords. Due to the cartridge controversy, Indian troops were never issued with the 1853 pattern Enfield. Instead, they kept their Brown Bess muskets, notoriously inaccurate even when used in their effective firing range of 100 yards, and next to useless outside of that range. Indian officers, who effectively functioned as NCOs for the sepoy regiments, were armed with rifles rather than revolvers. All of the sepoys were uniformed in a distinct variation of the red coat uniform, which they largely hated for its restrictive tightness and impracticable thickness, considering the heat of the Indian summer. It was not unusual for a marching force to lose 5 or 10% of their number to heatstroke, and this heavy, layered uniform with its woolen jacket and leather collar did little to help this. But back to the narrative. Wheeler may have been confident, but he was not foolhardy. On the 20th of May, he selected 2 buildings that sat on the open plain in the centre of the British station and ordered the walls loopholed and a rectangular trench dug around them, with the earth being piled up on the inside to create a makeshift earthwork, no more than 3 feet high in most places. Both structures were sturdy, brick-built and oblong, the larger of the 2 being a former dragoon hospital, and the smaller a residential building for the families and men of the 32nd Foot. The larger was also thatched and measured about 60 by 350 feet, whereas the smaller was tiled and around 50 by 190 feet. This area, which we'll refer to as Wheeler's Entrenchment, occupied about 9 acres and contained several structures in addition to the 2 barracks. These were a kitchen, a well, a large brick warehouse, various huts, 4 privies, and 4 underground powder magazines. Close to the southwest corner of the entrenchment was another well and a row of 9 half-built barrack buildings. Wheeler's plan was to defend these barracks first and then fall back to the entrenchment when they were inevitably lost. In addition to his pitiful garrison, he had 10 cannon, mostly 9-pounders, but with 1 3-pounder and a 24-pounder howitzer. These guns were sited in 3 batteries, one to cover the open plain to the northwest, another to cover the native troops camped to the south, and a third covering the barracks to the east. Wheeler's choice of entrenchment has been heavily criticised by historians. After all, why pick 2 isolated buildings in an open field over the heavily fortified magazine or fort in the city? In defence of Wheeler, he likely presumed that the Cawnpore rising would follow the Meerut template. The natives would murder their officers, sack the European quarter, and then retreat with their arms and loot to Delhi, to join the rest of the mutineers. If this were the case, then the entrenchment would not have to withstand a lengthy siege, merely be a small bastion to shelter the Europeans whilst the sepoys did their looting. Wheeler reasoned that by removing the Indian guard of the fort or the magazine in the city and replacing it with Europeans, he would provoke the already shifty sepoys and spark an earlier rising, and this certainly occurred elsewhere. It is also true that these fortifications were directly on the route any mutineers would take to Delhi. They were plum targets. The entrenchment was out of the way, and so probably safer. By the evening of the 20th, however, mutiny looked imminent. A mysterious fire in the lines of the 1st Native Infantry, probably the most disloyal regiment at Cawnpore, was most likely a signal to start the rising. But Wheeler took the first officers and a few cannon and went to inspect the troops, cowing them into submission for the time being. Rumours that the Europeans were planning a massacre were rife amongst the sepoys, but the night passed nonetheless without serious incident. Worried by how close the sepoys had gotten to revolt, Wheeler ordered all European and Eurasian civilians into the entrenchment. The officers of the native regiments would continue to sleep amongst their men to show that they had confidence and delay the inevitable mutiny, and Wheeler wrote messages to Sir Henry Lawrence, the commander of nearby Lucknow, who we'll meet next time, urgently requesting reinforcements. In response, Lawrence sent 55 men of the 32nd under Captain Lowe, who were welcomed by the fretting Europeans. Less welcome, however, were the 240 shifty-looking sowars of the 2nd Oud Irregular Cavalry who had accompanied them. Captain Hayes, who commanded the cavalrymen, wrote of the beleaguered garrison, quote, "I saw quite enough to convince me that, if any insurrection takes place, we shall have no one to thank but ourselves, because now we have shown to the natives how very easily we can be frightened, and when frightened we are utterly helpless." End quote. Wheeler made another unwise decision at this point. He decided to trust the most senior Indian nobleman in the district, Nana Sahib. Sahib was the adopted heir of Baji Rao II, the former emperor of the Maratha Confederacy, a major power in northern India that had, 50 years before, been crushed by the Duke of Wellington, then Sir Arthur Wellesley, at Asai and Goalga. When Rao died, the East India Company enforced the doctrine of lapse, their very unpopular rule that allowed them to take control of the lands of those who died without an heir. The doctrine forbade adoption, which had been a common way of securing an heir before EIC rule, and thus Nana Sahib was refused the lands that were rightfully his, and the pension that the EIC had paid to Rao in order to secure his loyalty. Nonetheless, he was a vocal supporter of the British, or so it seemed when he turned up at Cawnpore with 300 men and pledged to support Wheeler. In fact, he had been secretly collaborating with Bahadur Shah and the mutineers for years, trying to arrange a revolt. His original plan had been to join with the Mughal emperor, but his advisers persuaded him instead to take control of Oud, where he could be a ruler in his own right, not merely a subsidiary of a weak Muslim king. And so he marched on Cawnpore, where Wheeler placed him in control of the British treasury, a vast sum of 800,000 rupees. The general rightly feared that by moving the money into the entrenchment, he would provoke the sepoys into an early revolt, and that the sum would make his small force a target. He reasoned that the sepoys would be more amenable to handing over the money to one of their own, and who better than the powerful, seemingly loyal Nana? In reality, the Nana was preparing for all eventualities. His subordinates had attended meetings with the disgruntled Subadar Tika Singh, senior Indian officer of the 2nd Oud Irregular Cavalry and mutineer ringleader. If the British won out, then the Nana had been obviously loyal. If the British lost, then the Nana would help him on their way out and take over Oud for himself. Things were looking up at the entrenchment, however, and the steady stream of reinforcements from Lucknow and Calcutta, where the British government was centred, had eased Wheeler's mind somewhat, although he was certain that a mutiny was only a matter of days away. Nevertheless, he felt confident enough to return to Lawrence the half company of the 32nd Foot, and 4 days later they were followed by another 52 men of the 84th Regiment. His force had, however, been augmented by about 110 reinforcements. He was also, at this point, so convinced about the imminence of mutiny that he recalled all of his officers from their native regiments into the entrenchment. The colonels and officers of the 53rd and 56th Native Infantry Regiments objected, though, and, as Wheeler considered them relatively loyal, he rightfully thought the dangerous elements to be the 1st Native Infantry and the Cavalry Regiments, he allowed them to stay with their sepoys. Finally, at 1:30 in the morning on the 5th of June, the signal to start the mutiny, 3 pistol shots, rang out amongst the British station at Cawnpore. The instigators were the aforementioned Subadar Tika Singh and Havildar Major Gopal Singh, no relation, the 2nd and 3rd most senior officers of their regiment, the 2nd Light Cavalry. And, as Major Vibart, the CO, was safely in their entrenchment, the only opposition to the mutiny came from the most senior native officer, Subadar Major Bhawani Singh, also no relation. A veteran of the Sikh Wars, the longest-serving member of his regiment, and fiercely loyal to the British, Singh had been the only Sowar readmitted to the regiment after it was disbanded in 1840 for cowardice during the Afghan War. He refused to abandon his post or hand over the regiment's colours and regimental pay chest. Heavily outnumbered, he was beaten unconscious, and, laden with the colours and chest, the mutineers rode off to nearby Nawabganj. En route, a delegation from the Sowars rode to the lines of the 1st Native Infantry and demanded, in the name of the now unconscious Subadar Major Singh, that they join the mutiny. The sepoys armed themselves and formed up, marching also towards Nawabganj, but they were confronted by their distraught commander, Colonel John Ewart. He rode in front of them and cried, quote, "My children, this is not your way. Do not do this." End quote. Ewart had promised Wheeler, quite vocally, that his men would mutiny only over his dead body. Instead, his sepoys laughed at him and marched off, leaving him humiliated and very much still living. He then rode back to the entrenchment and vengefully asked Wheeler to pursue his men with the guns of his half-battery of the Oud Irregular Artillery under Lieutenant Ashe. The half-battery were the only native artillerymen in the entrenchment, and the only mobile guns at Wheeler's disposal. Ashe was given orders to leave, but no sooner had he left the entrenchment than the 53rd and 56th Regiments showed signs of mutinying, and Wheeler's position lay directly between them and Nawabganj, the mutineers' rendezvous point, so he was recalled. The 53rd and 56th had been on parade since a few minutes after the desertion of the 2nd Cavalry, and had been ordered by their still present British commanders to shoot any mutineers that approached on sight. At about 6, they were dismissed for breakfast, and almost immediately began preparing for desertion. Jemadar Khoda Bucks, the senior Indian officer of the 56th, had been harangued by his men, who attempted to convince him of their mutinous cause. He agreed until they left him alone, and then he immediately fled to the entrenchment to tell Colonel Williams, the commander of the 56th, the bad news. Williams and the regiment's adjutant rode straight over to the mutineers in a foolish attempt to convince them to stay. They got to within 300 yards of the regimental lines before a hail of warning shots convinced them of the error of their mission, and they returned to Wheeler. At the same time, Colonel Hillersdon, the commander of the 53rd, had gathered his Indian officers to discuss whether their regiment would stay loyal. Just as they managed to convince him of their staunchness, a sepoy arrived at Hillersdon's tent and told him that a party of Sowars had arrived, killed the sepoys and the subadar guarding the armoury and pay chest, and fled to Nawabganj with a portion of the 53rd's men, their colours, and the money. As of yet, though, the majority of the 53rd had not mutinied. Wheeler was surveying the situation from his entrenchment, and was advised, contrary to Hillersdon's pleading, to fire on the 53rd while they were still unprepared. Ashe told Wheeler that, unless his native gunners were in some way tied to the English, they would similarly desert. The general hoped that by ordering the Oud battery to fire on their comrades, they would be forced to stay, or be killed by their incensed countrymen. Although it didn't work, Ashe's men deserted in the afternoon of the 5th anyway. Nevertheless, the 3 guns burst into life, killing a few sepoys and scattering the rest, with the exception of a loyal few who fled to the entrenchment itself. Wheeler did not entirely trust these men, and his fortification was already over full, and so he ordered the roughly 40 Indian officers and men that had remained to take possession of the empty hospital building, about 500 yards to the east of the entrenchment. A few visibly loyal sepoys amongst them, Bhawani Singh and Khoda Bucks, as well as some doctors and a few native soldiers, were allowed to remain with the Europeans. The 40 men of the 53rd were unhappy, obviously because Wheeler did not trust them, but also because the hospital was, ironically, a death trap. It had no fortification and was exposed to artillery fire from every side. You can find pictures of it taken after the end of the mutiny, and it looks like a brick cheese grater. Wheeler assured them that they would be fine, but abandoned them to their fate. That morning, Nana Sahib had been awoken at his house in Nawabganj by delegates from the mutineers, who gave him the choice between ruling Oud if he sided with the mutineers, or being shot to death if he sided with the British. Unsurprisingly, he chose the former, and took command of the 1st Native Infantry and the 2nd Light Cavalry, convincing them that occupying Cawnpore was better than marching to Delhi, and promising them that astronomical sums of money, weapons, and ammunition were sitting idle in Cawnpore, ripe for the taking. After reuniting with the mutinous elements of the 53rd and 56th, the Nana turned and marched back to confront Wheeler on the 6th of June. Shortly after Ashe's party returned, the bombardment of the entrenchment began. Lieutenant Thompson recalled, quote, "As the day advanced, the enemy's fire grew hotter and more dangerous, in consequence of their getting their guns into position. The first casualty occurred at the West Battery, Maguire, a gunner, being killed by a round shot." End quote. Amy Horn, a young Eurasian woman, gives a good account of the conditions for civilians. Quote, "The site of our entrenchment was surrounded by large and substantial buildings, from 300 to 800 yards distant, occupied by the rebels, and from roof to window, all day long, a shower of bullets poured down on us in our exposed position. Shell likewise kept falling all over the entrenchment, and every shot that struck the barracks was followed by the heart-rending shrieks of the women and children, who were either killed outright by the projectiles or crushed to death by the falling beams, masonry, and splinters. One shell killed 7 women as it fell hissing into the trenches and burst. Windows and doors were soon shot off their sockets, and shot and shell began to play freely through the denuded buildings." End quote. Some of the bolder women, led by the late Captain Moore's wife, went to see Jemadar Yusuf Khan, who commanded the sepoy guard on the house, and demanded answers. His response was that his sepoys would not shoot women and children, and indeed when the orders were issued to execute the inhabitants, the sepoys refused. Tatia Tope, one of the Nana's senior advisers, was then brought in to resolve the dispute, and he threatened to have the entire guard executed if they did not carry out their orders. The sepoys decided to comply, and made a half-hearted attempt to remove the hysterical women and children one by one to be executed. When this proved too strenuous, they simply opened the windows and fired volleys into the house from outside, mostly, on their insistence, aimed at the ceiling. After a while, the sepoys again refused to obey their orders and abandoned their weapons. The woman who ran the house, known by the insulting honorific Begum, resolved to solve the problem by sending for her own lover, Sarwar Khan, a member of the Nana's personal bodyguard. He brought with him a group of Muslim butchers from the city, and the group marched into the building and cut down the indignant Mrs. Moore, who had tried to refuse them entry. The 73 women and 124 children who had been locked in that house were hacked to pieces, unable to resist or flee. The butchers used meat cleavers, and the Khan broke 3 swords, such was the force with which he struck people. Not all of them were dead, however. My source for the entire Bibigar massacre is John Fitchett, a Eurasian drummer who had been locked in the building with the captives. The Nana had forbidden the execution of Eurasians, so he and several other drummers were removed and shut in a shed across the courtyard from the blood-stained house. He describes hearing the cries of the wounded for several hours, as well as the shrieks of those few children who had survived the slaughter. After a few hours, the bodies, wounded, dead, and alive alike, were thrown down a well in front of the building. So numerous were the bodies that the wounded would have been buried alive under the weight of their dead. The children, all of whom were between 5 and 7, had their heads dashed against a large tree, and were also thrown down the erstwhile waterway. Instead, the task of defending Cawnpore fell to Captain John Moore, a company commander of the 32nd Foot, who had been left at the beleaguered city with his regiment's invalids. A tall, fair-haired, blue-eyed Irishman, Moore was, by all accounts, an excellent leader. Brave, determined and clever, he was officially in command of one of the barrack buildings, but came to supervise the running of the entire entrenchment, visiting every corner of the British position each day to inspire his men. Thompson wrote of him, quote, "His never-say-die disposition nerved many a sinking heart to the conflict, and his affable, tender sympathies imparted a fresh patience to the suffering women." End quote. His wife also deserves credit. She often accompanied her husband on his dangerous visits, and stayed in the threatened barracks so often to reassure their wavering defenders that they built her a small shelter. Despite suffering from a broken collarbone, having fallen from his horse before the onset of siege, Moore always led from the front, and was often personally involved in repulsing the assaults by the sepoys. Whenever his lookouts informed him of an approaching mutineer force, he would lead a dozen or so volunteers on a sortie to drive them back to their lines. His most dangerous foray was a night raid on one of the most dangerous of the rebel batteries. He took 20 men and crept, under cover of darkness, out of the entrenchment and towards the 2 howitzers that made up that battery. When they got within 100 yards, they opened fire on the unsuspecting gunners, killing about a dozen of them and driving the rest off. Moore and his men then spiked the guns, driving a wooden stake through the firing mechanism and rendering the guns useless. Successful, they returned to their comrades to a chorus of cheers. Nana Sahib was incensed when he heard about the destruction of his strongest battery. The gunner's commander was shot, and the Nana moved his headquarters to Savada House, much closer to his men. There he set up a 2-gun battery, manned by Ash's former subordinates, the gunners of the Oud Irregular Artillery. Despite this show of strength, the Nana had no real power over his troops. He was simply a figurehead. The real leaders were the Indian officers of the mutinous regiments, men like Tika Singh of the 2nd Cavalry, Radhay Singh of the 1st Native Infantry, and Gungadeen Missour of the 56th Native Infantry. These men are to blame for the poor showing of the sepoys at Cawnpore. Each was petty and factionalist, as was the Nana, and this caused a lack of determination or direction on the part of the sepoys. As Jonah Shepherd, one of the many Eurasian civilians in the entrenchment, put it, quote, "The mutineers were a most cowardly set of men, particularly the cavalry, for very often attempts were made to charge us, and, notwithstanding the very large number of people on the enemy's side, they seldom dared to come close, for whenever they advanced, a few charges of canister would soon disperse them." End quote. It is now that we rejoin the band of loyal sepoys from the 53rd and 56th Regiments, those 40 men who had been abandoned by Wheeler in the hospital building. They held out until the 9th of June, when a cannonball, wrapped in flaming cloth, struck the building and set its thatched roof alight. Those sepoys who had survived thus far fled once again to the entrenchment, where an unnamed officer told them, on behalf of the enfeebled Wheeler, that they could not remain with the British. Barred from the only relative safety available, and with their already precarious position now afire, the sepoys abandoned Cawnpore, but attempted to join up with the British relief force. Some did, but some were killed en route, and some returned to their villages. On the same day, a lone rider approached the British position at a gallop, and after being fired on by the sentries, he was captured and revealed to be Captain Augustus Bolton of the 7th Cavalry, who had escaped the capture of the British station at Fatagar. He had been shot in the cheek, but nonetheless was happy to be in the company of fellow Brits, and proved a stalwart defender of the entrenchment. On the 12th of June, the worst of the bombardment hit the entrenchment. At its height, a round shot or shell hit the British position every 8 seconds. By this point, the buildings were riddled with holes, and every door, window, and other extraneous part had been blasted away. On the evening of the 12th, the roof of the thatched barrack was set aflame. This larger building had been both a shelter for some 200 women and children, as well as a makeshift hospital for the many casualties. With the bombardment still heavy, and the rebels pouring musket fire into the entrenchment, the inhabitants of the barrack were caught between a rock and a hard place. Many chose to remain in the building, where they were crushed or burned alive by falling masonry and flames. Lots of those who chose to escape were cut down by the fire of the mutineers. The sick were unable to escape their fiery demise of their own volition, and, as the soldiers had strict orders not to abandon their posts for any reason, the duty of rescuing them fell to women like Amy Horn. She recalled, quote, "The women and children were panic-stricken, confronted on one side by the burning building, and on the other the shot and shell of the enemy's guns, which fell like hail from every side. They knew not where to run for protection. The entreaties of the wounded to be helped out of the flames and from the falling building was more than I could bear." End quote. At about midnight, the rebels mounted their first large-scale assault. Thomson's recollection here is excellent, so I'll tell it in his words. Quote, "They advanced by hundreds under the shelter of darkness, and without any sound from that side, with the intention of storming Ash's battery. They were allowed to get within 60 or 80 yards of the guns before a piece was fired or a movement made to indicate that they were observed. Just when it must have appeared to them that their success was certain, our 9-pounders opened up on them with a most destructive charge of grape, and our men shouldered multiple guns each, which they had by their sides preloaded. Every available piece was discharged right into their midst, and in half an hour they left 100 corpses in the open." End quote. The assault had been repulsed, and the garrison had survived, for now. I should also note that grape shot is a term for canister. Conditions, however, continued to worsen after the thatched barrack was lost. Every drop of medicine that the British had was reduced to cinders, and the amount of shelter available from the burning June sun had been reduced by more than half. The daily ration of food was, quote, "a handful of split peas and a handful of flour." End quote. Water was even worse, and there was only one well available to the British, and the mutineers knew this. Anyone seen drawing water would be fired at, and the machinery used to haul the water up the 60-foot shaft was quickly shot away by cannon fire, meaning that the onerous task had to be done by hand. After a time, one of the civilians, a civil servant by the name of John McKillop, took charge of distributing water. Thomson wrote of this, quote, "He cheerily said that he was no fighting man, but would make himself useful where he could, and accordingly he sent himself to that post, drawing water for the women and children as often as he could." End quote. After a week of this selfless and vital duty, he was hit in the groin by a musket ball and died shortly after. The scarcity of water was so acute that many of the women and children took to drinking the splattered blood of their many dead and wounded. By the 14th of June, Wheeler was desperate. He sent an appeal to Sir Henry Lawrence at Lucknow. A section of it read, quote, "We have been besieged since the 6th by the Nana Sahib, joined by the whole of our native force, who broke out on the 4th. Our defence has been noble and wonderful, but our loss heavy and cruel. We want aid, aid, aid. If we had 200 men, we could punish the scoundrels and aid you." End quote. By now he had only 8 guns still functional, all 9-pounders, and less than half of his original strength. By this point, however, as we shall cover in an episode very soon, Lawrence was too heavily outnumbered and also under siege, and thus was unable to assist Wheeler. Had he sent men, Lucknow would surely have fallen, and the force would never have reached Cawnpore in time, even had the approaches both out of Lucknow and into Cawnpore not been heavily garrisoned by the rebels. I'm going to leave it here for this episode, I think, on the morning of the 14th of June. It's been a bit of a grim one, really, for which I apologise. Next episode, we'll cover the end of the Siege of Cawnpore and its outcomes, and I'm afraid that won't be any better in terms of cheer or heroism. Nonetheless, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, there is a Patreon you can use to support the show, and it has a bunch of very respectable perks for those who choose to do so, not least a series of bonus episodes on conflicts too short to warrant their own episode. Patrons of all ranks will get a shout-out at the end of episodes, so if you do want to join the Obscure Fare rank and file and win my undying gratitude, go to patreon.com/obscurefare. Please also remember to fill out the feedback form in the description. It's very useful to me and free for you, so I'd really appreciate it. With the shameless self-promotion out of the way, I'll say thank you for listening. I hope you tune in next episode to see what will befall the stout defenders of Cawnpore, and I hope you have a great day.